Yeah. Okay. So time to start. Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's ECIPE online seminar, which is about the economic impacts of the reform of the EU's Product Liability Directive. I am very glad that so many people have registered for our event. This is not ordinary course of business, given that the PLD is very highly technical regulation that is very difficult to digest. And I think partly therefore it has seen relatively little attention by the media so far. At the same time, I feel that there is a strong demand, at least in expert circles, for getting a better understanding about how the changes of the proposed PLD will impact European businesses, consumers, and how they will impact Europe's economy at large. And this is because the PLD is horizontal regulation. It applies for very wide range of industries in the EU. And the changes recently proposed by the Commission would substantially extend its scope, namely to businesses that commercialize software, and also extend the list of compensable damages, like damage from psychological harm. The objective of our seminar today is to discuss the reasoning underlying these new provisions, but especially the potential impacts of major changes proposed by the Commission. And let me add that we actually wanted to have a parliamentarian attending our discussion to give us a sense of where we stand in the legislative proceedings. But unfortunately, MEP Pascal Arimant's office didn't respond to our invitation, and unfortunately, MEP Vlad Botos had to decline more or less last minute because of conflicting commitments. Now, that should not affect our discussion. I think, in fact, there will be more time for people in the audience to make valuable comments and raise questions. And that said, I hereby encourage you in the audience to raise your hand in the second part of the seminar and provide your inputs. As announced in our event invitation, me and my colleagues at ECIPE are currently working on a new ECIPE study on the economic impacts of the proposed changes to the PLD. The study is close to the finishing line, but we would like to benefit from your inputs as well. So if you have anything important to add, and if you don't manage to raise comments in this 1 hour event, please feel free to drop us an email. And we will consider these contributions when we work towards the end of our study. I will spend the next 15 minutes or so with presenting some of our major preliminary findings, and then we will have Karina Stan to give us her perspective on some of the major revisions proposed by the European Commission. Karina is the director of EU policy, and I think she's also the head of the Brussels office of the Developers Alliance, and she has recently closely worked with companies, especially from the technology and software domain, to get a sense of the consequences the revisions of the PLD will have. Now, let me continue with the presentation, and for that I need to share my screen with you. Just give me a second. Yeah, does it work? Can you see my presentation? Super, thanks for the feedback. So again, why are we here? I mentioned this briefly. The EU's Product Liability Directive is horizontal regulation that applies for a wide range of industries, as it applies to all products available on the European market. And now the EU is considering relatively far-ranging changes. The problem is that the impact of these changes are barely understood. Some of these changes, the major changes, include an extension of the scope of the PLD to all movables that have been made available in the EU market, now including explicitly embedded software, standalone software, including products based on or including artificial intelligence applications, but also related digital services. The European Commission is also proposing to include damage related to psychological harm, damage related to the loss or corruption of data. It wants to decrease or abolish damage amount thresholds for claims. And it wants to introduce disclosure obligations, especially for manufacturers and developers for of complex technology-intensive products. Now, in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, I would like to draw your attention to, first of all, some of the misconceptions and gaps in the European Commission's impact assessment before I continue with an overview of impacts related to major revisions to the proposal, with a specific focus on sources of legal uncertainty, sources of legal risks, especially for companies. I will have a few remarks on impacts on consumers and then conclude with a few general observations, findings, and broad policy recommendations. So as concerns the European Commission's impact assessment, the Commission evaluated several policy options in its impact assessment, which, however, do not exactly correspond to what has been presented in the initial draft of September 2022. There are several changes not covered by the Commission's impact assessment. For example, the impact of the abolishment of the maximum threshold of 70 million euros for claims. In addition to that, the Commission, when considering the inclusion of software to product scope, only focused on the ICT sector, the statistical classification of ICT services, but it did not consider companies in the manufacturing and services sectors that also develop software in-house and commercialize software products and related technologies. And another shortcoming is that impacts from the inclusion of damage to psychological health are only very rudimentarily addressed by the Commission, and I will get back to this in a minute. Generally, I would say that DG Growth's impact assessment is well researched, but, and this is mentioned at several places, it significantly suffers from lacking data. For example, when it comes to evidence related to damages that can be attributed to strict liability, but also lacking data when it comes to liability insurance premia related to strict liability, and also liability insurance coverage, for example, coverage taken by small and large companies or companies from different industries in the economy. The EU's Regulatory Scrutiny Board came to the conclusion, or when assessing the impact assessment, it came to the conclusion that the impact assessment is actually not sufficiently clear about the size and evolution of the problem. This also includes the robustness and the relevance of the so-called extrapolated baseline estimates. So basically a scenario or situation of a scenario describing what would happen if the PLD would not change in the near-term future. The Regulatory Scrutiny Board also states that the impact assessment is lacking a clear distributional analysis of the impacts on different stakeholder groups, including small businesses. And in addition to changes not covered by the impact assessment, there are several impacts that are not covered by the impact assessment. And this is important. And these impacts include, for example, the deterrent effect of increased legal uncertainty, increased legal risk because of unforeseeable liability risk, impacts from vague definitions in concepts that go undefined, which could result in different interpretation of rules and claims by courts. Then it is not covering the ability of companies to obtain insurance coverage in an environment of increased risk of being liable under a revised PLD. It is referring to impacts on SMEs, but only very rudimentarily. So there is no clear differentiation between impacts on larger companies and smaller companies. I'll also get back to this in a minute. There's no discussion about the negotiation power between companies, small and large companies, along the value chain when they manage their liability risks. And this is important for complex value chains, including value chains in Internet of Things industries or use cases. It is silent about social inflation in claims related to liability insurance. And there is not much analysis of the wider economy-wide impacts of legal uncertainty on innovation, trade, and investments in technology-intensive industries in Europe. Now, when it comes to the impacts, I think the major takeaway so far of our impact assessment or our ECIPE study is that the proposed changes would indeed provide some legal clarification regarding the scope of strict liability requirements, but they would increase systemic legal risk for a large number of companies in the EU with respect to unforeseeable future claims on the basis of strict liability, on the basis of the potentially revised PLD. This includes uncertainty about the number and nature of legal disputes, especially when it comes to technology-intensive products and services. This is about uncertainty regarding decisions of judges, which are not anymore as predictable as they were in the past, and uncertainty about who in the value chain is ultimately liable on the basis of no fault-based liability. In our study, we offer a broad econometric analysis of impacts of legal uncertainty, and generally impacts of increases in legal uncertainty are very difficult to quantify. But we find that all sizes of companies are sensitive to legal uncertainty. We also find that technology-intensive industries, which are typically very investment intensive, are more sensitive to legal risk than less technology or less digitally intensive industries or companies. And for EU production, we find a very strong impact of legal uncertainty on the value-added generated industries with high technology intensity, and also the ICT services industry when looked at an isolated way. And the issue with the PLD now is that the revisions would increase legal uncertainty for businesses operating in the EU. And there are several sources of additional legal uncertainty. Some stem from the inclusion of software and artificial intelligence. The biggest challenge stemming from strict liability is that software and app developers can now be held liable regardless of their intent or knowledge of defectiveness. Currently, liability claims are dealt with such that product manufacturers and also software developers have contractual arrangements where they share and shift liability. Under a revised PLD, all companies contributing software to a product or a component could still be held liable for no fault-based errors, even if they had limited their liability risk in contractual arrangements with the buyers or users of their software solution. And then there are risks from no fault-based liability because they are difficult to assess for companies and also insurers. These concern the size of the damage, but also the likelihood of collective redress, for example. And for complex software and product solution, fault is very difficult or even impossible to assign to an individual entity in the value chain. And this means that there is a major problem for insurance companies because they may not be able to assess which part of the value chain contains the greatest product liability risk. And therefore, insurance companies might deny coverage of strict liability. And this is partly reflected in some of the estimates provided by the European Commission for changes in insurance, in liability insurance costs resulting from some of the proposed changes. And I looked into the impact assessment. It is pretty kind of cumbersome and time consuming, but I tried to make sense of the data and put them on this slide in a consolidated way. What you can see here is the estimated changes of liability insurance costs depending on which proposal is finally chosen, or which proposed change is finally implemented or materializing in the PLD. And in simple terms, what you can see is that if the commission, or if the next PLD would only include software that is necessary for tangible products to operate to the PLD, insurance costs would on average only increase by 3%. If the EU were to include all standalone software, plus abolish the 500 euro threshold, plus ease the burden of proof for consumers, not the reversal of burden of proof, but easing the burden of proof, plus introducing immaterial harm, then insurance costs would increase by 25%, which is substantially higher than the 3% number for the scenario that would be the most preferred option from the perspective of businesses. But this is just an indication, and I shall say that since we do not have good data, the European Commission did not have good data about liability insurance coverage and risk premia that can exclusively be attributed to strict liability insurance. These numbers should be interpreted with caution, and of course, these are average numbers, and in reality, the numbers, of course, are different for companies of different size classes and companies that operate in sectors that are deemed more risky than ours. Now, another source of legal uncertainty stems from the inclusion of software-based digital services, related services, how it is put in Commission documents. The inclusion of software-based services does not account for what we would call the fundamental differences in the risk profile of products and services. Movable products typically have distinct use cases with a range of foreseeable associated risks. And this is different for many software applications. And having too many possible and unforeseeable liability risks from potential use cases can, of course, companies to restrict or no longer offer a certain service in the EU. And there is a deterrent effect on companies, a deterrent effect on small companies which lack the financial resources and provisions for risk, and also a deterrent effect on larger companies which may find themselves subject to collective redress risks, class action, activist claims, and may not be able to insure anymore against risks from strict liability. Then there's legal uncertainty stemming from the inclusion of damage from loss or corruption of data. The Commission's impact assessment actually highlights that losses of data on physical means of storage, a hard drive, for example, but it at the same time states that there is hardly any case law that you can examine on that side. And the impacts on providers of data-intensive software and digital services are also difficult to assess generally. And in the impact assessment, these impacts have entirely been ignored. Generally, the value of personal data is usually subjective. And opinions differ, of course, about the value, and therefore damages from the loss of personal data are extremely difficult to define, and as a result, extremely difficult to objectively quantify by courts or, let's say, technical experts. And we call this a rather unlimited expansion of individuals' legal rights, and this will likely result in differences in the enforcement across the EU 27 and contributes to more legal fragmentation rather than a harmonized approach towards solving liability issues. Another pretty significant source of legal uncertainty is coming from the inclusion of damage related to psychological health. Legal risk for products and services providers would only be amplified if policymakers decided to extend liability risk to damage to psychological health. Similar to the value of the data and the loss of data, psychological health or mental illness in general are very complex types of damage to assess, and the opinions of medical professionals frequently differ. And then there is the issue of social inflation, which is a well-referenced trend, well-referenced by insurance companies, referring to higher costs of insurance companies when paying compensation, referring to activist plaintiffs, high claims called for when making a claim before court, referring to class action. And that would disproportionately hit companies developing and commercializing software and AI products in the EU, likely larger companies where redress would have higher chances of generating compensation for a larger number of people. And anticipating or responding to increases in litigation and associated costs, companies may decide to leave or at least discontinue offerings in EU member states markets. And finally, one remark about the easing of the burden of proof for complex technology products, including software services. The PLD proposal states that there will be no reversal of the burden of proof, as this would expose manufacturers to significantly higher liability risks, and this could hamper innovation, leading to higher product prices and reduced access to innovative services. So this is stated in the PLD's justification before the recitals. However, the Commission still proposes to alleviate the burden of proof for complex technologies, including AI-based systems. And this constitutes a de facto reversal of the burden of proof for many technology-intensive products and services, despite the Commission's impact assessment advising against a reversal of the burden of proof. And as recognized by the Commission, this is another source of legal uncertainty that could hamper business activity, especially innovation, and have an impact on prices. And there are, of course, impacts on consumers. I'm coming to an end. The first impression is that consumers will have stronger rights and there will be benefits for consumers. But there is actually no strong evidence of why it is such a big problem that currently software and mental health, for example, are not covered by strict liability. The Commission's input assessment is silent, largely silent, I shall say, about why consumers have difficulties making claims or why their claims are rejected by the courts. The general argument is, well, because software and digital services are not included to the PLD. But it is also kind of understating the importance of other consumer protection regimes, like contractual obligations and so on, or GDPR, Article 82. Problem is that even small changes in legal uncertainty would have a significant impact on producers of technology-intensive products in the EU. Difficult to quantify, difficult to assess, let's say, ex ante, but there will be impacts. And generally, some companies will stop serving EU customers. So the number of offers will go down. Prices for remaining offers will likely go up. And then, of course, there's costs coming with compliance related to compliance and risk management related to the new regime making provisions for liability risks, and also trying to purchase insurance coverage at higher costs, and that will also be passed on to consumers, and it will be reflected in higher prices. Some concluding remarks. I mentioned this. The major conclusion of our study is that the proposed changes to the EUSPD would increase systemic legal risk. The legal risk that companies in the EU are exposed to, for a very large number of companies in the EU. In addition to that, important impacts have been ignored by the Commission and also policymakers in the Council and the European Parliament. We would broadly recommend to halt negotiations, to pause negotiations within the Parliament, within the Council, and in the negotiations between the institutions, because more evidence and better assessments are needed. We would recommend to approach more legal experts to get a better understanding about the impact of contractual arrangements to share liability risk in complex value chains, in regimes where software, for example, is not covered under a strict liability regime and where software is covered under a strict liability regime. Insurance companies should be consulted. It's very important because we need to get an understanding how this would impact risk insurance premium, and also the ability of companies to obtain insurance coverage for strict liability. And after all, we should get a better understanding of various businesses' impacts, especially when it comes to relationships with commercial and private customers, also including the ability and modes of liability risk management along the value chain. And some policy contributions before I come to an end. Narrow the scope of product to critical use cases. Example that you often come across when you look into the literature is medical devices or related medical services. We consider or exclude damage from loss or corruption of data. We consider or exclude damage related to psychological harm, prevent speculative claims, prevent malicious claims, activist claims, and class action, limit the easing of the burden of proof to cases in which evidence is strictly necessary, and also keep the minimum and maximum thresholds for claims. With that, I would like to pass on to Karina, who will give us her perspective, and then we can enter into a debate.
Thank you, Matthias, and good afternoon, everybody. So just to make a little introduction about whom I am representing, we are a small but very active association at global level, advocating on behalf of software developers. We promote the growth of the software industry and innovation. And of course, we are very concerned about not only about the revision of the Product Liability Directive, but also other proposals that we see them in conjunction with this one, and we also see, of course, the cumulative impact of all these legislations, because all these pieces of legislation, because in the end, a company, doesn't matter the size, will have to be compliant with all of them. So in a way, we see PLD just on top of all the, let's say, normal usual regulatory compliance that a company needs to. So it will add, and I appreciate the study that you are doing. It's quite timely and it's quite relevant, because it all translates into the cost of doing business. So I think this study is very important to, you know, to give an idea, a glimpse on what will be the, you know, the impact of on cost of doing business in the EU for software developers, because we have this extension of the strict liability regime to all kinds of software, including digital services. In this point, we joined recently a broad coalition of associations representing technology companies, and we co-signed a joint industry letter that was published yesterday. I think I will share with you. I need to find the link, anyway, so we. In this letter, we are pointing out several important aspects that should be, you know, carefully considered by the co-legislators when, just because of their impact on the industry. And first of all is this disproportionate extension of the scope to software in general, including AI applications, but also to services. And then a disproportionate extension of harms, the material harms, especially when it comes, and you mentioned also the psychological harms and the loss of corruption of data. And then we point out on undue disclosure obligations and the de facto reverse burden of proof, and also on you know, on the need to have a minimum and maximum damage thresholds to avoid you know, frivolous litigation, and last but not least, the need to ensure a consistency with other EU legislation, especially when it comes to the chain of liability. Because if we are talking about digital services, well, we have Digital Services Act, we have other pieces of legislation, product safety, market surveillance legislation already adopted. So I think there is a need, you know, on the side of co-legislators to ensure legal coherence here, not only when it comes to notions, the legal notions, and here we have but also when it comes to obligations. And I was talking about legal notions because our main concern is related to the notion of software that is not defined, and to the notion of services. There is a very there is a lot of legal uncertainty, is a very gray area when it comes to this proposal. What is a product? What is a service? I mean, the Commission in the beginning said we don't want to cover services, but only some related services. And now we see amendments in the Parliament speaking of expansion of the scope, proposing to include even digital content. Well, I would recall the co-legislator that you know, significant amendments should be always accompanied by some kind of impact assessment justifying that significant amendment. And I think what is important in with this proposal is just you know, I think it was not, that's why we, you know, we, another association, we are calling for the co-legislator, but not necessarily to pause the negotiation, but just to, you know, to take a step back and just to, you know, to revise all these aspects and to think about the objective. First, the objective is of the update, the legislative update is just to have, you know, to ensure legal certainty. Well, we see now that we have a lot of legal uncertainty, so that part should be fixed, and there are ideas, there are you know, suggestions that could improve the text, but also to see you know, because in the end we talk about a piece of legislation that that it's meant to ensure a high consumer protection. And I think the co-legislator should take a look also and consider if certain you know, intentions from the Commission, maybe they are satisfied by other you know, other specific legislation. Maybe certain situations that they have in mind is sufficiently covered by contractual and tort law. So especially when it comes to, for example, we talk about data. Well, we have you know, in the EU a strong you know, data protection framework. Why is not enough? So if we want to cover a certain situation, then maybe we, you know, the legal text should circumscribe those situations. When it comes to psychological harms, and we have the scope extended to all kind of software applications, then we need to see exactly what situation do we have in mind, what exactly do we want to protect consumers from, and why these are not addressed by others. I think we if we look of already adopted legislation and legislation to be adopted, I think we have a lot of situations that are covered. I don't want to go into too much details. I would let the, you know, the audience to you know, to interact with us, but I would like to have a final point on you know, on in general on the impact on, you know, on software costs, but also availability in Europe. Speaking of cumulative effect of all these regulations, and your study is confirming our concerns, but also on the competitiveness of European developers in general, because you know, in the end, all these costs will be transferred to European consumer wallets, and I think we need to be careful about that, because currently we have a lot of software applications, a lot of digital services that are quite affordable for consumers. And I would like to stress that, you know, software developers, they are not against regulations, they are not irresponsible, on the contrary, but they favor clear rules, you know, which allows them, like any other economic operator in the end, to have a predictable business environment. And I think that's why we need to have in the end a framework that will allow predictability, that will allow a uniform application across the single market, and also something that will not overburden the courts in the end, because speaking of thresholds, speaking of you know, giving an incentive to you know, to claims for, you know, frivolous claims, that will overburden also the courts. I think that on the contrary, this legal framework should provide the national courts, you know, with a, you know, like a solid framework to cover, you know, a variety of situations, but in a uniform manner. And last but not least, I think we need to be careful not to apply a higher threshold and a stricter legal regime to services that are offered digitally, comparing to similar services that are offered offline. And these are falling under fault-based regime. That would be unfair. And also, it should not be, this framework in the end should not be a disincentive, you know, for innovation. It should not be, you know, a disincentive for uptake of advanced digital solutions. Because if we give this this message, let's say, to European consumers that if you have a product that has software in it or even a little bit of machine learning, it's dangerous and doesn't matter if something you have the impression that something goes wrong, then you should complain, and you should. I think we need to encourage to see how software works. It works only through hardware. It has to be embedded, enabled to hardware in order to to function, in order to produce effects on people. So we need to recognize that. We need to see that digital services and all the consumer protection on digital service, digital content, we have already this covered. So again, the question is, what exactly do we want to protect consumers from? And let's see how to improve the text in order to capture exactly what is not appropriately captured by other legislation.
Thanks a lot. Allow me one more follow-up question. I mean, all of these provisions, they are pretty abstract. This is what you have when you have a legal proposal, and they are filled with life when cases evolve, when judgments are made. Now, is your impression that businesses developing, commercializing software have entirely understood what they will face if the proposed changes will be adopted? And could you perhaps give us and our audience a few examples where businesses are concerned that the PLD could potentially impact their business for the worse?
Well, I mean, we see already, for example, and we right from the beginning, when engaging with the policymakers, we saw the need to explain how software is developed, first of all, because there is a huge part of the debate is allocated to the impact on open source, because it's inevitable. I mean, open source is the basis for all software development, and we saw the open source community now raising and engaging more and more and explaining, how exactly things are working in practice. But I think beyond open source, we need to explain how you talked about value chains, because software in the end, and I mentioned, is embedded, is deployed through different devices, through different, so you inevitably you have value chains, you have more people involved. It's not only a direct developer consumer relationship. There are rare cases of that. Usually you have longer or shorter value chains in that, and usually there is no standalone software affecting directly the user. I mean, again, it has to be enabled, and the user needs to take certain extra steps, in order to do so. You have certain interactions taking place. I'll just give an you can provide updates, for example, security updates, but I think everybody knows sometimes it's annoying, but you have to to push a button. You have to accept those updates. You cannot do nothing as a user and then complain that your device is not updated and it's not secured. If those updates are provided, then so in this situation we need to see who is liable and for what. Coming back to the I mean, again, I would have another practical example, we have, for example, web applications, web apps. I mean, I always give example, the mobile apps. Look at your phone and see how the diversity of apps, and put yourself the question, is it worth to have strict liability for any of the software developers of these applications? When it comes to an operating system, of course, the phone will not function properly if it's the operating system is malfunctioning. But when it comes to applications that are downloaded, I mean, it is not justified. If there are certain situations that the policymakers are concerned about, maybe we should look in other parts where, of consumer protection framework, where those are covered. Or if they are not covered, of course, they should be, in principle, they are all covered. But if there is something that is not covered, I mean, we should receive those examples, because I didn't hear anything. But coming back, mobile application, but web application, if we have any web app, but I will take the web browser, everybody knows. It's like a highway to the internet, So a provider of a web browser, why should be under, the highest strict liability for what? Because on the highway, it's up to you, the consumer, which direction you take, and you can end up in different places. And why should be the web browser, again, the question, under a strict liability? Is it justified to have this regime? What are the issues with web apps, for example, in order to place developers of such applications under such a strict regime? So I think we don't have a detailed debate on that, on this kind of practical examples, and to see, I mean, because if we talk just in general, software might malfunction, and I mean, that when we will have in practice concrete claims, and I don't think it's proportionate. I don't think it's fair to have claims just for anything, and then to let the courts to deal with that, and then you said, I mean, we should ask also because in the end, any business is dependent on insurance in order to do business. So we need to ask the insurance industry, what are the challenges with that? Because I'm sure on certain aspects there are things that are very hard to quantify. And it came into my mind, cybersecurity. And I think, again, there is a misconception in the whole debate. And I heard a lot of policymakers that are, they are starting, they started working on the assumption, or I don't know, they think that software is, is 100%, should be 100% secure. Well, ask any, software engineer, there is no such thing. So I think we need to take into consideration, all these aspects, and then to see if it's appropriate to have such a strict regime in this, because it's a huge difference between a traditional, material product that once it's produced in a factory, is finished, and there are clear standards for doing it, and the nature of software, and again, software in general, software application in general are more akin as services. So the lack of a definition of software, the lack of a delimitation of those types of software that are really affecting products, the functioning of the product, that is something that is missing. It's encouraging, though, that I saw in the parliament the preoccupation of certain policymakers, and I would encourage them to go into that direction, and and to link to the functionality, the software to the functionality, the core functions of a product, which makes sense. So just an idea that there are ways to improve the text, and that will be helpful in practice afterwards, and just to respond to those situations that really justify such a high level of protection for consumers.
Yeah, I mean, one particular feature of software is that, with the exception of some critical use cases, bugs are generally accepted by us as kind of inherent to software development.
Because I mean, any software contains bugs, but with a few bugs, software can function very well. And of course they are addressed by regular software updates. That's why we saw again those annoying updates for users. Sometimes those are mainly, a lot of them are safety updates. And just speaking of updates, I think it's important also to correlate with other pieces of legislation, because again, there are a lot of things that are addressed by other parts of the EU legislation, also maybe at national level. But when it comes to updates, we have obligations for updates. So I think the duration for which the updates should be provided should be aligned with what is in the Cyber Resilience Act, for example, what we have in eco-design regulation, we have in digital contracts also. So I think the co-legislator should put more effort into aligning, because otherwise we will end up with conflicting or very difficult to comply with obligation.
Yeah, I mean, what we propose, or are likely to propose, is to narrow the scope to give up on this all-encompassing approach to cover software, standalone software and digital services by the PLD, but rather have sort of a kind of a positive list annex where you really refer to very critical services. But speaking of critical services like medical services, but also certain AI application, and given also that we do not, that I haven't seen a question so far from the audience, maybe a final question to you. What is the interaction between the PLD proposal that is already on the table and what is currently being discussed for the AI Liability Act?
Yeah, well, first of all, PLD is a framework for a no-fault, so-called no-fault liability regime. When it comes to AI liability, it's an attempt to harmonize, when it comes only to AI, the fault regime in the member states. So there are different legal regimes for liability. But I would also make a link with so of course the AI Liability Directive will have a direct link with the AI Act, but I would also make a link with PLD with AI Act, because we have this high risk approach. It's not for nothing. I mean, it's justified, just because, I mean, if we put again a strict liability regime on any, disregarding the risks, then I don't know, maybe it's inappropriate. So maybe a good thing will be if, let's say, the the scope will not be narrowed too much, then at least to make a link and to make a reference to high risk AI, to those products that are based on application of high risk AI, because again, and that is also valid for cybersecurity requirements. When we have the Cyber Resilience Act, we will have software applications that will be CE marked as high-risk AI systems. So they will be CE marked, and that will be useful for developers in court to show that they are compliant with the essential requirements. That will be, again, I'm trying to be constructive in the debate and then suggest solutions to improve and to alleviate a bit the legal uncertainty.
Okay, yeah, thanks for this clarification. And we received 2 questions. I would take one. Do you know if the changes are suggested based to known cases, or is it to prevent future damage? Now, given that I looked into the comprehensive impact assessment of the Commission, the implementation assessment from, I think, 2018, I think the latter is to prevent future damage. We haven't seen many cases or many issues in the past that would give rise for concern. At least this is my impression. One question from Aline Lautenberg, who is interested in understanding what is the reaction of policymakers where you present your concerns and proposals, and then also how you see this playing out together with class action and the deletion of the quantitative threshold.
Yeah, well, I would say, I mean, we have policymakers that are willing to understand. I would say we have policymakers that are very, let's say, they are going into a direction of extreme consumer protection, like protecting for, any foreseeable and unforeseeable risk, quite excessive. But we got, for example, a lot of good reactions just because, especially in the parliament, just because they discovered that there are very technical issues. There are issues quite technical, like the relationship with open source, how software is developed, what role plays the open source, and how to and they are careful. For example, they said, oh, we don't want to to have a negative impact on open source, but how to do that? So we saw openness, but we see again a lot of excessive care to cover pretty much everything. Just I don't know, just disregarding what we have in other pieces of legislation. And when it comes to class action, yeah, well, I think this is an area that is a little bit superficially treated, in my opinion. I mean, the risk of frivolous litigation and the risk of, incentivizes a certain culture, class action culture here in Europe that we don't have, but we see in other jurisdictions, especially in the US. I don't think that is the intention of the policymakers. But again, if we have and the deletion of the thresholds, it's exactly it provides exactly that incentive to that kind of culture. And again, we need to think not only on the burden of the economic operators, but also on the member states, on the courts. I don't think that is the intention.
Okay, yeah, I don't think that's the intention either. I don't think. And I mean, I would be interested in hearing from coders what they think about the interaction between the code they produce themselves on the basis of open source code. So if there's a claim arriving, they can say, no, the fault is not on me, it's the open source code that's incorrect. But people did not complain in other cases, which is why
we would have another webinar entirely dedicated to that. But I would say that we should not put a burden on those contributors to open source. They should be exempted. That's for clear. But anybody who is developing commercial software, of course, they should be responsible for the software that they are putting in the market and for the consequences. But and even doesn't matter if they rely entirely on proprietary software or they use open source resources, because sometimes it's not only pieces of code, might be open source tools, if they are using via APIs, or doesn't matter. In the end, if they are building a commercial a software application, yes, but we need to see in which cases that software application is justified to be under a strict liability regime, because why contractual, why tort law, why other legal requirements coming from other legislation, specific legislation, depending on the area. You talk about medical devices, but we will have on cybersecurity already covered with the Cyber Resilience Act. So that's why we are asking why a lot of software application would be needed to be under such a strict regime.
Okay, thanks. I think we need to come to a close. There's one more comment saying that the council has not been paying attention to businesses' concerns, and that the council is rushing to an agreement because of the approaching end of the legislature. I mean,
yeah, that's why we said that we have a broad coalition of associations representing basically the entire spectrum of the industry, and we want to draw attention to to the need to slow down a little bit and to consider all this. I shared our joint letter. And to consider all these aspects, more carefully. And again, I mentioned a lot of, improvements, a lot of fixes that can be done.
Yeah. So that would be, it's a perfect closing statement. Hopefully, legislators will give themselves a little more time to understand what is going on. Also, giving some time to companies that don't have this PLD on their radar. I hear from companies that I wouldn't call software manufacturers, that they didn't have it on their radar, and that there might be a wave of potential claims coming to them. So I think more time is needed to digest what all of these proposed changes could imply for businesses. Hopefully, the council will take a little more time to reconsider positions. And then perhaps we will have another debate in a few weeks ahead about the file. But thank you very much, Karina, for your valuable input. Also, many thanks to our audience for staying with us that long. The offer is standing. If you have any comments or questions, please reach out to me or also Karina. And with that,